I figured that I was going to live my life and go through my career in the U.S. as a volcanologist without ever seeing an eruption within our borders. And so I pretty much figured that I'd have to go outside the country to visit erupting volcanoes. So when Mount Saint Helens woke up in the spring of 1980, it was too good to be true. I could hardly believe that it was really happening, especially because I was very familiar with the volcano, and I knew what kinds of things it had done in the past, and I knew the geography around the volcano. So it really had an impact on me.
One of the things that we'd kicked around is incessantly from probably 1960 to 1975 is, when will one of these erupt? Which one will erupt first? What's the chances of it erupting? But by the time we realized that it was an order of magnitude more active than the other volcanoes, so it was pretty clear. It was not a difficult call to say that St. Helens, in terms of probability, would be the next one done.
And so my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't reload my camera, put another roll of film in it.
The first thing that came in was a report from Spirit Lake. They'd heard two big booms, this as I remember it. And then very short time later came the reporter's transmission from an aircraft that he could see a plume coming up through the clouds. I think he could not see the volcano at that time. That meant it had really happened and the world was going to turn upside down.
We had some pretty strong discussions about whether or not we should be in the volcano, around the volcano, etc., for personal safety reasons. And the other side taking, well, we got to get the science while it's available.
And I remember that the hazards team, Crandall, Molyneux, Hoblet, and Miller, who were living in Denver at the time, that we received a notification very early on, right after March 20th, when the first earthquake began. And that was the beginning of the most hectic, I don't know, 10, 12 months of my life, I guess. We watched very closely as the earthquake swarm escalated in March. And on the 24th of March, I think it was, Don Molyneux came out here to Vancouver. And I think it was the 27th of March, Rick Hoblet came out. And then at noon on the 27th, there was the first explosion. And that got me going. And so I got in an airplane and showed up at Portland Airport at 2 in the morning on the 28th of March. I mean, I remember 2 in the morning because I immediately rented a car and raced over to Vancouver to the Forest Service office and ran down into the basement and looked at the seismic drums to see what was happening. And that was the beginning of a, 18-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week, 7-month investment of my time and energy trying to figure out what was about to happen and then dealing with it after it did happen.
And there was this big press conference with several TV cameras. The national media were there, and Forest Service and USGS people were talking, and I had to give a spiel about what I'd seen, which was essentially nothing. So my first impression, in other words, was one of not quite chaos, but certainly an unmanaged situation where we were just reacting to what the volcano was doing rather than knowing exactly what was going on because of this bad weather and the nighttime observations.
One of the best comments, or the most illustrative comments, was by a state forestry man who stood up and said in this room, he said, "Do you mean to tell me that we can put a man on the moon and you can't even tell us whether the volcano will erupt or not?" And I said, "That's correct. We cannot tell." People just assumed we should be able to know. And then that was the 26th, the 27th at noon was the first, or about noon was the first pop. And then things spun wildly out of control as far as my part of it went, because it was just 20 hours a day of questions. try to explain things to people. Reporters came in swarms.
Volcanoes don't take the day off, so you work 7 days a week.
But Rocky and I had been around so much that we knew the details of the geography as well as the geology that we were trying to explain to people. And that was a great advantage, because we had to, with many people, we had to establish credibility to a skeptical group.
We were sitting in this Jeep that I had, whatever it was, a Ford Bronco, I think, by one of these cans that Andre and I had set out to collect ash. I wanted to just see what it was like, and I looked in it and was sitting in the car after that, taking notes. And Barry, I was in the driver's seat. Barry's on the other side. And this earthquake occurred. Wong, wong, wong. When you're in a vehicle, sitting still with the engine not running, it's really, and the vehicle itself, with a higher center, really accentuated. We just swayed back and forth, and it lasted. It just seemed like it lasted half a minute, but it wasn't that long. It was quite impressive. That was certainly the one I felt the most of that period. And about 15 minutes later, when we were through, we drove down and we stopped in at Harry Truman, who had come out of his lodge, and he sort of waved us in. So we went in and had a Coke or something with him. He was drinking his typical Coke in a Coke glass, what looked to be Coke, but it was Coke and whiskey, of course. Mm-hmm. And so we had quite a chat with Harry. Harry said, that is the earthquake everybody's going to talk about. All the chandeliers swayed east-west here, not north-south as they had before.
And so it was a highly charged atmosphere. It was very exciting. It was pretty, I guess it was frightening to be on the volcano. We were having earthquakes of quite regularly magnitude 3, sometimes over 4.
We couldn't believe the results, because the results showed absolutely no change between 1972 and 1980. Even though visually we could see the north side of the mountain changing, that meant that the east side was not changing at all. And so this coupled with the fact that the Spirit Lake tilting didn't show anything, told us that all the deformation on the mountain was local to the mountain, and even more local than that was on the north side of the mountain only. So we were really able then to focus in on that part of the volcano rather than frittering away our resources by looking at the entire edifice.
By the time I got here, the bulge was obvious, and we were measuring the rate of northward movement of the bulge at about 6 feet a day, and we knew that wasn't so good.
In the nearly 2-month period before May 18, what was essentially happening at Mount Saint Helens was that magma or molten material was moving up from some deep reservoir beneath the mountain up into the volcano itself. And what basically happened is that this viscous magma moved up into the volcano, and it began to grow or form what we call a dome or a cryptodome inside the volcano. And that inflating body of magma or molten material actually broke the north side of the volcano and began to cause the north side of the volcano to expand out toward the north. This was what was happening for the 2 months before May 18.
There was a growing wave as this thing went, and I'd been through several that size before, so I knew what was coming, so I had to take down both instruments and lay them on the ground because they would have been knocked over. And then I sat there and tried to ride it for a while, and it just threw me on the ground. It was that much of a rolling earthquake, and it seemed to go on forever.
The morning of May 17th, a German visiting graduate student and I went out to remeasure the stations. We started at Butte Camp. We had 3 different instrument stations that we occupied: Butte Camp, Toutle, which was above the South Fork Toutle, on the divide between the South Fork and North Fork Toutle, and then Timberline parking lot. So we started at Butte Camp, and the day before, or a couple days before, I had heard from Jim Moore, who was in Menlo Park, that it looked as if, on the basis of the photogrammetry that was being done, that maybe the south side was starting to move a little bit too. So I decided to put in a new reflector station for the geodometer and the theodolite on the summit of the mountain, but south of the main crater. And so we flew up to that area mid-morning on May 17th, and I established the reflector, and the German graduate student was on a butte camp and said he could see a signal and so forth. It was a beautiful day up on top, warm and sunny. So the pilot shut down the helicopter, and the two of us walked over to the lip of the crater and peered down into the crater and spent some time there, and then walked back through really almost slushy snow at more than 9,000 feet, but it was just really wet and mushy. And so we got back to the helicopter, I guess, and flew back down to Butte Camp between 10:30, quarter to 11, something like that in the morning. Dave Johnston, then, who was going to spend the night at Coldwater 2, did, and that's where he died. Went into the crater even later than that. He was flown in the sometime in the afternoon on May 17th, and actually walked down and collected a sample of water from one of the meltwater lakes down the bottom of the crater. And so he was the last person in the crater, so far as I'm aware.
On the morning of May 18, I was driving up Interstate 5, headed up to the north side of Mount Saint Helens with some parts and some batteries for our time-lapse cameras. And as I glanced over at Mount Saint Helens, it was a beautiful blue sky day, and the mountain was sitting out there, and suddenly I saw this mushroom cloud go up above the volcano and climb rapidly up into the stratosphere. And I had seen a number of the small steam explosions that had been occurring for the 2 months prior to May 18, but I had never seen anything on this magnitude, and I knew that it was a huge eruption compared to what we'd seen so far. And so I crossed over the center line and headed back into Vancouver and raced back to our office.
Well, on the morning of May 18th, we had our normal meeting at 7 o'clock or thereabouts. Earlier that morning, Dave Johnston had been able to make a measurement with using the Rangemaster that he had, Coldwater 2. He measured from there over to Goat Rocks on the volcano, and found that there had been no change in rate of movement, actually a slight decrease in rate of movement since the last time the measurement had been made some time before. So that was reported at the meeting. And then I was preparing to go up and replace Dave that morning, but someone was going out to get some supplies, some groceries and so forth, and said, "Hey, I'll get some groceries for you too." I don't remember who that person was now. So I didn't go right away, but waited around at the Forest Service building for the supplies to come. And I was down in the room where the seismographs were at 8:32 in the morning, and I heard a sound, and I just looked over my shoulder, probably just a split second after the earthquake, the big earthquake had started, and saw that this was something very large, larger than we'd seen before. Watched it for a few seconds just to confirm that, and then I ran upstairs to the next floor, up to the radio desk of the Forest Service, and called Dave. And what I wanted to do was to ask him if anything was happening at the mountain, and we couldn't get through. There was no answer.
And ran over to the radio and tried to raise Dave Johnston, and gave him a call. And when I didn't hear from him, and I didn't hear the repeater answer me back. And our repeater was located up on Coldwater Peak, which was quite a ways north of Johnston Ridge, and way up high. And so I suddenly realized, well, something really serious has happened. If Coldwater Peak has been blown away and the repeater is destroyed, then I figured there was something awful had happened at Coldwater 2 as well. So I guess I had the realization right away that this was some kind of a tragedy. And on the one hand, it was this huge, exciting, and interesting magmatic eruption, and on the other hand, I was pretty certain that something terrible had happened to Dave. So it was a strange day for me.
The Forest Service got phone calls saying that some people were seeing an eruption column starting from the volcano, and so I drove to Pearson Air Park immediately, and I don't remember if I was ordered to do so by Bob Christensen or if it was just decided that I would go. The Forest Service had a spotter plane ready to go. Dave Gibney, their normal pilot, was there Remember, this was early on a Sunday morning. It was amazing. And we were off the ground probably at 9:05 or something like that. I mean, it was really, really rapid. And got up to the point where we could really see the mountain well, I suppose between 9:20 and 9:25, something like that. By that time, the blast had been completed. Of course, we could never get around to the north side of the mountain, so I couldn't see what had happened there, but we were able to see the south side very well. The flank was scored by mud flows that had come down it. There was this terrific, very vigorous vertical eruption column that was the stem of the mushroom or the toadstool that then blossomed out at greater height. And we could see during the course of the morning small pyroclastic flows starting down in various places down the south flank, never getting very far. But for most of the morning, we saw this tremendous, whenever we could get around toward the west side of the mountain, saw this tremendous ash cloud roiling out toward the northwest. And I can only assume that was coming off of the big pyroclastic flows that were going off in that direction that later built the pumice plain. It was a very eventful morning, but it was sobering because I remember thinking up in the airplane that Dave just couldn't have survived this, especially when we got around to the west side and saw all this ash headed in his direction. It was totally quiet to us in the airplane because of the drone of the airplane engine, I guess. All we could hear was that and the conversation in the cockpit and the radio. People were radioing in, telling us that there were mud flows in various river drainages. We could see those in all the drainages except for the main fork of the Toutle. But it was almost a surreal experience because it was so quiet. We could see so much happening, and we were in this kind of cocoon in the airplane that we couldn't escape from. I was out there on the plane in the plane until it had to come back to refuel. I think around 1 o'clock or so that day.
You had to see it to believe it, to get that total impression, so that when people through the summer said they wanted to see what happened, I would suggest to all of them that they first go down to Pearson Field and buy a ride on the plane and go up and make a loop around the mountain, because I thought only then could you really understand how the part you could see from the ground fit in with the overall eruption. And it was stunning to see those small increments that you could see on the ground, and realizing that is such a small part of the overall devastated area or the affected area.
On the morning of May 18, what actually happened was that a magnitude 5.1 earthquake caused this weakened north flank of the volcano to break loose and to slide under the influence of gravity down into the North Fork of the Toutle River. This was a gigantic landslide. That was the first event in the series of events that occurred on May 18. The landslide basically uncorked this pressurized body of magma and allowed it to explode or expand out towards the north very rapidly. This is what we call the lateral blast. It was a horizontally directed explosion of incredible magnitude. It caused this expanding cloud of ash, rocks, and gases to move out across the countryside to the north at speeds of several hundred miles an hour. The directed blast was really the most destructive event that occurred on the morning of May 18. It completely destroyed an area of 230 square miles in the matter of somewhere between 5 and 9 minutes. It essentially killed every living thing within an area of 230 square miles, and it destroyed hundreds of acres of virgin forest, and it was an incredibly spectacular event.
There were places north of the volcano which was left pristine. There was old growth in there because it was a major playland for the Portland area, and just huge trees, and you could walk in there and not hear a sound because of vegetation mat, and it was just a gorgeous, wonderful wilderness there. And to know that in your mind, actually having seen it 4 days beforehand, and come back and see it all gone, that was quite a shock. It took me about 2 weeks of flying across the boundary of the blast zone before I stopped having that physical, emotional hit.
The first 2 weeks after May 18th are kind of a blur to me because so much was happening so quickly. In general, though, I'll tell you that I, along with Jim Moore and Pete Lippman, spent a full day on May 19th flying around trying to figure out what had happened on May 18th. And we got the general picture in order then, although, of course, the very important details were done by others later on. But we wanted then to reestablish as much as we could of the older geodetic network that we'd been used prior to May 18th. And so over the next few days, as time permitted, we would revisit some of the old reflector stations, and they were all damaged beyond repair. But we tried to recover a couple of them and got approximate changes over the eruption. We put out new stations, and we quickly started to remonitor the volcano again because we had no idea what was going to happen down the road, and we thought it likely that there would be more eruptions during the summer, and indeed that took place.
Later, I wondered if Harry Truman had maybe painted himself into a corner by being so firmly saying, "I'm never going to leave." So even if he had at some time become convinced that it was too dangerous, because it didn't take an eruption to wipe out Harry, just a landslide failure of that expanding bulge would have taken him out, I think.
So this avalanche came down the North Fork Toutle and just pushed all the trees in the valley out of the valley down at the head of this avalanche. So at the front end of the avalanche was this big giant pile of trees and fence posts and bushes and shrubs that had been just scraped off the valley floor and were all down at the end of the avalanche.
When I was flying in the airplane on the morning of May 18th, I was using an old Bell & Howell 16 millimeter camera with a spring wind-up thing, so you could only take a scene for 10 seconds or whatever, 15 seconds, something like that, and it would run out. I had 7 or 8 100-foot rolls of film with me that I exposed 7 of them. This is the old camera that I used, the old movie camera that we used for filming the May 18th eruption column. It winds up here. I've got it all the way wound up here. Look through a sight here and just push down, and I'm filming you.
So this episode at Mount Saint Helens, which began on May 18, actually culminated in October of 1986 when the last magma came out of the ground. Obviously, for volcanologists in the United States, the Mount Saint Helens eruption was a spectacular learning opportunity. And before the dust had literally settled in the summer of 1980, there were USGS scientists swarming all over the area out in the blast zone, studying the pyroclastic flows, studying the debris avalanche deposit, studying the directed blast deposit, and basically looking at all of the different facies of the May 18 event.
So then we'd have a meeting where everyone would either bring in their data and discuss it and what they thought about what the volcano was going to do. So there were some crews that were looking at what the volcano did during that eruption. So there were months spent investigating the May 18th deposits. And then there were people who were out measuring deformation and the real-time situation at the volcano, so to try to discern what the volcano was going to do next, trying to recognize patterns that the volcano was going to do. So these discussions would last an hour and a half of reporting what had happened that day.
Jimmy Carter came on a certain time, and the day after that, people throwing helicopters at us. So from that point on, we had nobody had any trouble getting into the field who wanted to. And I teamed up with Dan Zarishin, and we had this beautiful A-Star, French A-Star, brand new helicopter that Cascades Helicopters got, and the president of the company is flying it. He's very proud of it. I don't know why he would bring such a thing into such an ashy environment, but it was in the wake of something exciting local. It's called Cascades Helicopter. I mean, how can you not have that name? How can you have that name and not fly at Mount Saint Helens? So we had this beautiful ship. That was when I started doing the in-close stratigraphy, and I already had a handle from outside, so I was bringing the same stuff in, systematically, and we flew in around, Spirit Lake and put in stops there, and gradually I was getting into thicker stuff, and there were other things besides airfall deposit, the stuff that fell out of the sky, to work on it, and it just was part of the same stratigraphy. So that's what led me eventually into other things.
Anyway, it was really clear that there was nothing left at Coldwater 2, and the car was gone, the trailer was gone, and there was no indication of anything there. But we landed just downblast from Coldwater 2 at the bottom of the South Coldwater drainage on these new hot deposits. And I tell you, it was like walking on the moon. I will never forget the feeling we had. We asked the pilot to keep the engine running. First of all, he had to touch down very gently and try to move it around and find some solid place, because the blast deposit was very soft and very irregular in places and quite inflated. And there was smoke coming out of there, steam coming out of the ground in hundreds of thousands of places out there. So it was like walking on the moon. There was nothing living as far as you could see in any direction. There was no sound except the helicopter running. And no insects, no animals, nothing green, just gray.
It was just, it was out of this world sort of experience. And every step you took was a place that nobody had ever actually had stepped before. It was sort of, it made an impression. Of course, most of the time we were working our tails off, and we were all exhausted. We were working 20-hour days, 7 days a week. So there wasn't too much philosophical introspection at the time, although it would hit you once in a while.
And so we were out in the field on July 22nd in a helicopter, and we were down looking at some mud and on the North Fork Toutle, and we were out of radio contact. And so when we got it back in the helicopter, took off, flew back to the volcano and came up from underneath the clouds, and here was this 20,000-foot ash column rising up, and the radio going, it's still at 30,000 feet and climbing. And where we were in the helicopter, you couldn't look up to the top of the we were so close, you couldn't see up to the top of the column of ash. And so that whole next several hours were full of we were running out of film because we didn't have enough film. It was like a battle with not enough bullets, more ammo, and had to count all our rolls of film and see how many we had so we could make sure everyone had a couple of rolls of film. We had landed on the ground, and one of the geologists was taking a temperature measurement of the ash flow. And he had his back turned to us. The people in Vancouver were telling us to get off the ground because they didn't know what the volcano was going to do. And we were right next to an ash flow, so another ash flow coming down would be right where we were. And we couldn't, nobody wanted to get out of the helicopter and go get the other guy and pull him into the helicopter. And there's no siren or anything to tell him to come back. So it wasn't until he had finished and finally turned around that we were all, get back in the helicopter.
So Rick and I got out, and we ran around and wandered around in this hot stuff, trying to keep from sinking in and burning ourselves. And there were these weird little volcanoes that were produced where these fumaroles were coming out of the ground, and material had piled up to form these little miniature volcanoes. And the whole area had this incredibly strange organic stench to it because of all the cooking vegetation and the distillation of vegetation that was taking place under the surface. I remember Rick and I dug some holes, and there had been a light rain on the top of the blast deposit, and so the upper part was wet, but when you dug down more than a few centimeters or so, it was gray and white and hot, and it was just like hot ashes. And when you tried to dig a hole in it with your shovel, this stuff would just flow back and forth like hot fireplace ashes.
I guess what amazed me is some of the events. One of them that really amazed me is what happened at Spirit Lake, and we still haven't told that story. It's a sort of hidden story, but it's very clear. Probably maybe the third day of this helicoptering with Zerition, we landed over at Harmony Falls, and you could see the whole shores of the lake had been stripped of trees. The trees were down in that. They weren't really stripped by the blast, but they were all laid down. But then below a level, there was like a line below that, and every tree was gone from that. And the log was full of, the lake itself was full of logs. And so it seemed that there'd been a big slosh of water around there, and it had rinsed off the lower slopes and had put the timber in the lake. That's why it was there. So, I mean, the timber, all the timber in the lake didn't make sense. There's no way for it to be thrown in, but you could see if it's washed in. I started working on that a little bit, and you realize, geez, when you got up, it was hundreds of feet. I don't remember now, maybe 600 feet or so above the lake that this water had clearly washed to. Might have even pushed it higher, 650 feet a little later.
And I realized that this was hot. It was a piece of the cryptodome, and it was so hot it dried out the ash and kept it dry, even though there had been some rain. And so I brought out a big plastic sample bag, and I picked up this rock and put it in the quickly, and put it in the sample bag. And then when I turned around to look somewhere, it melted its way right through the bottom of the bag. Anyway, it was incredible. Hoblet and I were blown away by what we saw. We stayed there maybe half an hour or so while the helicopter was running, and we just couldn't get enough of it. I mean, we were taking pictures, running around digging holes. It was incredibly exciting and very interesting and all new and intriguing. And then we got in the helicopter and we flew around. It was still very dusty, and there were phreatic explosions, rootless phreatic explosions taking place above the North Fork of the Toutle River out in the Pumice Plain. And some of those were going to 18 or 20,000 feet. So it was a pretty hard place to get around in the helicopter because there were a lot of ashy places that we really couldn't visit safely without getting into the ash.
We got to, the Forest Service kept airplane around the mountain 24 hours a day for 6 months or more. And so the opportunity to go on that airplane and fly for 3 hours around them watching the volcano and looking at things was available for us. So I used to go out at 3 o'clock in the morning and get on the airplane, view the volcano in the darkness, and so you could see the glowing lava from the vent. And you could also see all the burning trees that were blown down. The trees actually, I mean, a lot of the forest caught on fire from the blast and the hot rock. And this stuff was burned all year until the snow, and then the next spring, when the snow melted, some of the big logs were still on fire. And you start seeing a couple of those places around the mountain in this next spring in '81.
Up in the head, that would be the north end of the west arm of Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake's kind of like this two-fingered lake, and the head of that is called Bear Cove. Up in there's a chunk of the debris avalanche, a landslide I was calling it. That was pretty amazing because you have to, for it to get there, what it meant is the landslide came down off the volcano, across the plain, went right through where Truman's Lodge was, into the lake, and they must have ridden the floor of the lake bottom all the way and come up on the other side. And there it was, a big deposit of it up on that upper end of the lake. These huge hummocks of dacite and basalt and stuff that had come off the top of Mount Saint Helens. And this crazy hummocky pattern that we had begun to recognize as somehow indigenous to that particular slide. And this might have been later. I think that actually might have been in July when I went up there for the first time. I can't remember now. But I just remember being so impressed. I think it was July or even August, being so impressed by it. So there were the hummocks. And behind some of the hummocks, that is on the side away from the lake, there were gigantic log jams. They're still there probably, but they were clearly water laid. There were rocks in them and huge things, almost as high as the hummock. And they were on the north side of the hummocks. So that was a record of water that had been jammed up into that arm and gone way up on the slope, which you could see that you could still see this line, of course, bare below and trees, laid down trees above it. That's a record of that water having been thrown up there and rushing back at this huge flood into the lake again and making these gigantic log jams on the back sides or on the sides of these hummocks, the side away from the lake.
The pyroclastic flow had floated on some sort of pneumatic cushion and had not even dropped things through a lot of that area because it was moving fairly fast onto that area. And then, so there's this great big pond, so you could actually walk on May 18th deposits right down to the pond, and then there was this pond of this new stuff. And so I was in Pig's Heaven for measuring temperatures. Here was this huge pond that had actually been deposited less than 8 hours beforehand. So I went down and decided to walk out on it, and of course the first step, my foot disappeared up over the boot top in this fluff. It was just very highly inflated powder, and it was inflated with air, hot air. Basically, you had to incorporate it on the way down the mountain. But I wanted to get out on it, so I realized after a couple of attempts that if I did a tentative pat to see whether I was going to sink in, I sort of formed a snowshoe or an ash shoe. And the more I patted, the more fumaroles I would generate, and the bigger the area would get. So you could actually pat it enough so you could deflate enough of that deposit to make a sort of a shoe, and you could stand on it. And then you could do it in a second. So you'd walk out doing the patty, patty, pat, and patty, patty, pat. And so I got out quite far on this pyroclastic flow and was able to measure a temperature profile both vertically and laterally through this thing. But if you took one step without doing that, of course, you just disappear. And it was pretty hot, 650 degrees centigrade.
And after about 2 hours of circling over this and not seeing anything, suddenly this immense black eruption cloud came pouring up out of the white layer that the cloud tops. And I couldn't believe my eyes. I mean, I thought, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life.
But eventually what we did was we got big boards, 2 by 12 by 2s, and put riveted straps on the top of them, and they were, maybe give you about 2 square feet of thing, and then you could walk on it without doing the pat.
And they start to smolder.
Yeah, or they burnt. Yeah, they're really good for about 2 or 3 days, and you had to go down to the lumber yard and get a new pair.
Oh boy!
There were a lot of innovation in those days. Things that we did to try to cope with the fact we didn't have the right equipment at the time.
So the first time the helicopter turns its engines off, and it wasn't quiet in the crater. The crater was full of noise. I mean, rocks crashing, and you could hear, it was continuously rocks falling down the crater walls and crashing, and there were hissing noises of fumaroles around the sides of the dome that we had never heard them before, because the helicopter was always blanking out this sound. And so it was a kind of a realization that there was something else happening in the crater that we hadn't experienced yet.
But it was truly only the beginning of an eruptive episode that lasted for a little over 6 years. So the first explosion occurred on May 18, and then there were several sizable explosions in the summer of 1980. And they sort of trailed off until October of 1980. And then for the next 5 years, or 5.5 years, there were a series of dome-building eruptions in which molten material came out, very viscous, pasty lava came out on the floor of the crater and piled up to form a dome or a mound in the middle of the crater floor, a feature that's now about 900 feet high, sitting on the floor of the crater. So this episode at Mount Saint Helens, which began on May 18, actually culminated in October of 1986, when the last magma came out of the ground.
And we've noticed that there were cracks developing on the crater floor that radiated out from the dome, more or less like spokes radiating out from the hub of a bicycle wheel. We didn't know if that cracking represented cooling of the hot crater fill that had been in place on May 18th, or if it represented swelling and extension of the crater floor. So we decided to start monitoring those cracks just to see what we could learn about them, and we brought out pieces of rebar a foot or two long and drove them into the ground and got out our trusty tape measure and simply tape measured the distance between these rebars. What we found is that leading up to the explosion and dome growth in late October, the cracks we were measuring were opening. And they seemed to be opening at an ever-increasing rate leading up to the last period of measurement before the dome growth. So that was kind of interesting, but just one of a kind. And so after the dome had been enlarged in October and things had quieted down, we went back in there again, found some of our old stations and put in new crack measuring stations and measured them through November and through December, and the cracks were widening again and at an ever increasing rate, which led up to the dome growth at the end of December. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that there were two periods that looked pretty much the same, so maybe this is predictive. So in January, we started doing the same thing. We also started climbing on the dome at about that same time, but we were continuing our measurements of the cracks, and the openings started to accelerate again. And so at some evening meeting we had over at the Forest Service building, I told Don Peterson, who was the scientist in charge here then, Don, I think that we're going to have another dome growth, period of dome growth within X days from now, based on the cracks. And he was intrigued, but we decided not to say anything publicly because we only had these two examples to go on. Lo and behold, we saw the same pattern before the next growth, which I think was late January or early February. And so, therefore, we felt pretty good about that. So the next time around, leading up to the late March event, we again saw this pattern of increasing rate of opening, and so we then started going public and started making predictions with a time window within which we thought the eruption would occur on the basis of the rate of opening, and it worked, and we all felt very, very good about that. A very simple, obviously simple technique, basic, just making a measurement with a tape measure, but this worked remarkably well and was very useful to us and to the Forest Service in anticipating when the next period of crisis would be.
There was one time when I knew I smelled bacon and eggs in the crater, and one of the crews was cooking. They come up in the morning with breakfast, and you could cook it over the hot cracks, fry eggs and bacon and stuff.
We learned a lot about how you interact with the civil defense, with the public, with the press, and that was transferred by the press to the world. And as a result, I think volcanology took a multi-giga quantum leap in science as well as applicability to society's needs. And I think it was probably the most important eruption in the history of volcanology.
I think all of us were a little numbed by having lost Dave Johnston, and I knew two other people who were killed in the eruption as well. And so we were both more wary of the crater than we might otherwise have been, because that was the source of the problem. And also, speaking for myself, I was also motivated by those deaths to try to do better than I was doing before, to down the road try to save lives that to kind of make up for the loss of our colleagues. So I think we were both cautious and moved to do better as a result of what had happened on May 18th.
The subsequent eruptions were actually, most of them were forecast fairly accurately by the USGS team of scientists. So when it looked like another explosion was about to take place, our helicopter crews would pick us up and we'd move out to the outskirts of the blast zone. We'd watch and photograph the next eruption. As soon as the eruption stopped, we'd race out there and study the deposits while they were still hot, while they were just after they'd settled onto the ground. So it turned out that the 8 years that Mount Saint Helens was erupting in the early 1980s was an opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity for USGS scientists to study hot, fresh, young, and exciting deposits from explosive volcanism. And we basically, we learned incredibly new and important bits of information about how volcanoes like Mount Saint Helens work, what kinds of deposits are produced during these explosive eruptions, and how to anticipate and mitigate the consequences of explosions.